Hello, and welcome to this special episode of Beyond the Headlines. I'm Mina Al-Oraibi, editor-in-chief of The National, and I'm delighted to be in this conversation with Martin Griffiths, who is now executive director of Mediation Group International, but is known to most of us as the former Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs at the UN and Emergency Relief Coordinator at the UN, somebody who has worked in diplomacy, humanitarian affairs, development, and mediation for many years. And it's a delight to have you here at the National in our studios in Abu Dhabi. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great privilege to me. It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you. So much is going on in the world. A lot of the developments in our part of the world, you have been a first-hand witness to history. Some of it very troubling, and others can give us some hope. So I want to talk about those. But first, I want to discuss an essay you wrote in August with the anniversary of the UN turning 80 in September. It was a big moment.
Yeah.
But you wrote a very frank essay. You said, the UN is in crisis. The UN has essentially become a doctor confined to treating the symptoms of disease rather than tackling root causes. How did we get to this point?
I think it's because the world has changed. And the UN has not kept up with these changes in the way that I would want it to. That's why I talk in that essay about relevance and the courage needed to be relevant, not to avoid opportunities and risks, but to take them on. The UN has the landscape, the talent, the mandate, less funding, but it's not going where the people need them. And I know that directly from my job as the humanitarian chief, because in that job I went to the crisis zones around the world, of course. And everywhere I went, I found that there was an absence of political diplomacy. Different ways it existed in Gaza, as we see today. And humanitarians were sort of last man standing there. And they didn't like it either. And I sort of imbibed that. And I know from personal experience the UN can do wonderful things.
So there's the point of the politics, because the humanitarians can only do so much.
Yeah.
So why is the politics so absent? Is it the member states? Is it the P5? How is global governance at such a stalemate?
I think all of those. I think, first of all, the P5 and the sort of the way in which the Security Council has been essentially neutered by the use of the veto. It's become a discussion forum, not an action forum. And we need it to get back to its original purpose. But I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. So that's part of it. So there's a sort of reluctance as an official in New York to thinking, well, we're going to get a mandate to do this and this, to do international peace and security. But now we don't so much. That's okay, but it's not sufficient. There are the good offices of the Secretary General, which we have seen so often used before and are not being sufficiently used now, I think. And that's essentially because member states are closing off options for this sort of adventurous and, I think, very tangible effort to really sort of do something useful on the ground. Black Sea Grain Initiative was exactly one of those efforts, but there should have been more, and there could have been more, and there could be more, but you need a bit of courage. So I think it's partly the institutions. I think it's certainly the member states. And I'd emphasize that, of course, it's the member states who need to talk about reform of the UN. And what they do is they just complain, a lot of them. That's not good enough. We need a bit of constructive help.
So the Black Sea Initiative, a grain initiative, is such an interesting moment in history. So this is, Ukraine's been invaded by Russia. It seems that there's no real push because, again, as Russia is a member of the UN Security Council and, can use the veto to stop the Security Council from doing much. And there's a real division in the world about NATO and the future of it. The history is long, but you were able to get involved and actually get grain moving because the rest of the world was all impacted, tangible. So what made that a success at a moment when everything else was failing diplomatically? Is it because people need to eat, because governments felt it at home that they had to create momentum? How did the momentum get created?
It's a really good question. And I mean, it was such an honor to be in that position. But how it started was Secretary General Guterres went to Moscow, not liked in a sense by other member states for doing that, but he went, and he had a long meeting with the President Putin, and he came out, and he hadn't told me about what he was going to talk about beforehand. He came out and said, right, I think we've got an opportunity to do a grain deal. And I said, really? He said, you're running it. I said, really? Really again? So he started it. And in fact, he was involved daily in our discussions and negotiations. But also, perhaps more importantly, the Black Sea grain deal was a great example of humanitarian diplomacy, because both parties that we were mediating between, Ukraine and Russia, frequently said, we need to do this for a humanitarian purpose. It's the only way we can sell that to our base, in effect. And so, and then there was controversy. Was it humanitarian? Was it, whatever? And I said, I don't care. It's just getting the food out and making a deal. And but it was humanitarian cover, really. I mean, genuine cover that allowed it to happen and allowed us to push off quite a lot of skeptical governments, particularly in Europe and elsewhere, who thought it was going to, embolden the Russians and I don't know what. But we found a camaraderie, oddly enough, as usual, right, between the negotiators, and we built on that.
And Turkey played a role, because
Huge.
one of the things we're seeing in the modern era is the role of individual countries that can come in and really either build trust or at least have the interlocutor that is able to deliver.
Yeah.
So how important is it having these third parties?
I think that's become the fundamental requirement today, and Turkey played that role magnificently, because the UN was not really welcomed into that negotiation by one of the two parties at least. Turkey played it very straight, said, no, this has to be a partnership with us in Turkey and also with the UN. What it means is, however, that they, of course, follow their interests. I think that's perfectly understandable. I don't have any problem with that. But I think they can often use advice from independent or professional or helpful mediation people about the principles of mediation and how you do this and how you don't do that and how you who do you see first, and these sort of techniques or tricks, if you like, are essential to mediation and negotiation. Everybody knows this who's been involved in it, as you know. So I think there's a need for a new partnership. It wasn't there before. Back when I started doing mediation, we could do it ourselves, and I was an independent operator at that time, but no longer.
But today, there's a very interesting role that you are playing now as that independent mediator. So tell us a bit about getting out of the UN and going back to that ground of playing an independent and yet trusted name that people know.
Well, I love it. I loved it when I left the UN in 1999 and set up this Center for Humanitarian Dialogue in Geneva, which is, I think, the world's largest private diplomacy organization, as they put it. The freedom to go and do and speak as you wish, well, it's a freedom you have here, obviously, as well, in the national, is extraordinarily encouraging. Of course, you don't have the access that I don't have the access I would have had, but I now know a lot of people, and I have a record, I hope, of some occasional successes, not many. And that, I think, affords you access. So recently, I was in Damascus just a week ago, talking to people there. I'm planning a visit to Port Sudan. I'm planning a visit to Kandahar. And I think the role that I would offer, and hopefully of value, is one of an independent friend, not a partial person, not one with interests, except to stop wars and build peace. And these places, all of them, have real needs for that. It's not easy to build peace. It's much easier to stop a war. Building peace is hard stuff.
And often it's the question of, do you put all your effort in trying to build peace, even if it means justice has to be suspended?
Yes.
If not denied, but at least suspended. And that's the case we see in all the places you named, and of course, very much so in Palestine. So
Yes.
I want to spend a moment to talk. You had mentioned Gaza at the beginning of our conversation. Now that there is this phase one of a ceasefire deal, and inshallah we'll get to phase 2 and 3 and hopefully get to a point where we can talk about a real long-term solution for Palestine. How do you see the moment now, and can the ceasefire hold, and what is the role for these interlocutors, be it countries or even people who can be a friend or at least a trusted interlocutor?
I think it's a very, very important moment with great potential. I'm not sure I would have gone about it in the same way that it has been done. I think the non-inclusion at the early stage of the Palestinian people has been an extraordinary omission, and that's putting it kindly. But nonetheless, the energy, the push, the drive from these, Qatar, Egypt, obviously Washington, D.C., is a guarantor of at least a fair try. However, it's very much a matter of mediation judgment, whether you ignore the difficult decisions about governance and security, you focus on ending the fighting, which of course I would support as a humanitarian, as people need food and aid and survival. They need their lives back. But then if you don't think about those other things until later, and I know it's now being looked at very, very carefully, and there's a lot of energy going into it, there's skepticism. And popular will and popular opinion, as you know much better than me, is incredibly important. And if you're a Palestinian now, you'll be puzzled, I think, as to whether this is a new sign of hope or whether this is just a temporary effort before a rearming and a resumption of the war, which I think is possible. Of course it's possible. I've been involved in ceasefires in many places, most of which have failed, but all of which have changed the landscape. And I know how difficult that is. And if you're only focused on that, you miss other things out. So I hope it gets there. It's time.
The governance element is a big one. This idea of a board of peace, of having external figures, some known, some not known, run Gaza for some time. Can that work?
I hope it doesn't, in a way. I mean, that's a terrible thing to say, isn't it? But, I come from a country which had a colonial empire, as you know, and the British were running large parts of the world which they didn't own. And I think the same principle applies here. And it's not as if the Palestinians can't govern. This is a highly sophisticated people and with a long history and with great talents. Of course they can. They'll need to reform the Palestinian Authority and so forth, fine. But I don't see how we can have an open-ended commitment to external rule. I don't think that meets their aspirations. It's contrary to the whole two-state solution for a start, but it's completely contrary to what the United Nations is set up for, which is about decolonizing, which is about the rights of peoples. So it's a step back, I think, in the wrong direction. So I hope it'll be changed through these discussions now.
I mean, the idea of actually the role of the UN at the moment, I mean, UNRWA being completely sidelined, and also getting to a point where the UN can be excluded without, again, any repercussions. That only adds to the weakness of the one body that all member states are members of, even if they disagree with some of its bureaucracy.
I think the Secretary General Guterres spoke out about this many months ago when there was a possibility of reconstruction. It was a passing thought. I think he said he doesn't expect the United Nations to be accepted because of the public criticisms of how Israel went about their war of self-defense. But and certainly it would apply to me. But I don't see that was a failure. I think that was right and proper, and it should have been made clear without interests. But the absence of the UN in Gaza, apart from the humanitarian efforts, which I knew well, is a terrible moment for the world and for the United Nations. I was involved in Kosovo when Sergio Vieira de Mello was the first head of the UN after the war, the NATO war. And I remember he went off to East Timor. So two big operations of this kind, overseeing territory and people pending their own evolution. So I think, it worked. It was
It
great
worked.
success. I mean, the UN is able to assemble, as I know from the Black Sea, huge talent right across the landscape. And often when there are these real projects, they don't bicker either. They really get together as a team, as is certainly in my experience. And we can't do it in Gaza or the West Bank. And it's really, really sad. It's appalling, worse than sad, that UNRWA has been so vocally excluded from anything. I find that unacceptable, of course. And I think UNRWA there have never been any confirmation of those claims made earlier on about their involvement in October the 7th. I don't think the UN managed to get any evidence from those who made those claims and so forth. So it's just wrong that they should be excluded this way. Plus, of course, they are a backbone of operations in Gaza.
I mean, this is one of the issues, be it schooling, be it healthcare, in any post-conflict situation. That's where you really do need the UN or whoever is capable of delivering on those. And that's what UNRWA's been doing for decades. So how the Palestinians will be able to deliver that, or whoever is going to try to take the role of the Palestinians, will be yet to be seen.
Well, it's worth watching, isn't it? It's worth watching. Who is going to do those services? Is it going to be overseen by the Palestinian Technocratic Committee? That would be a lot better. How is it going to be funded? By whom? I mean, UNRWA is defunded, as you know, for the last couple of years. But also just staffing it. UNRWA has, 10,000 staff in Gaza? It's needed if you're doing those services. And it's not easily replaced and not easily trusted. A replacement is not easily trusted. And UNRWA has built up trust in the Palestinian population.
An interesting development that's happening in the region is in Syria. Because if we talk about Palestine at the moment, there really is no clear leadership of who's going to take ownership, who the world can engage with directly. And it's the complete opposite in Syria. And, we've seen regime change in this part of the world from Iraq in 2003, the maybe test case of how not to do it,
Yes.
to Yemen, which started with an amazing GCC P5 agreement. You had the UN permanent members of the UN Security Council and the Gulf Cooperation Council come together and do a really neat transition, and that got overturned by the Houthis, Ali Abdullah Saleh, and the rest is history, and we'll come to Yemen, which of course you're an envoy for. But then we have Syria, where you do have a leadership, and generally people have accepted that, yes, this will be a leadership for a sustained period of time before there's talk of elections and handover. So that's the flip side of when you do have a hierarchy. Does that allow for the transition to be better or more stable? And what would you be advising the Syrians?
I think Syria is such a wonderful country for a start. I went there recently, first time for a couple of years, and I found it really amazing to be there at this moment. And it was fascinating to see the enthusiasm and hope for the new Syria that's coming out of the new transitional administration and its leadership, which wasn't there before, and of course was product of a military victory. But there's also, secondly, the truth that transition is hard work. And what surprises me and disappoints me is that many, many countries around the world, potential donors, potential political supporters, are still stepping back and waiting to see if this is going to work. Syria is probably the most advanced model example now in the world of building peace. It's remarkable, coming out of this 12 years of horror, and with, graves and jails and chemical weapons and God knows what. So we need to make sure this works. Everything should be made an effort of to really do it properly. So what happens in Syria doesn't stay in Syria. It moves other parts of the region and hopefully the world with its emphasis on how to build peace. So the stabilization of Syria, and we know what the issues are of how much devolution or not, how to deal with local militias and how to deal with Israel in the context of Syrian territorial integrity is very important as the first thing. And I know that's obviously the focus of the new administration. But what's interesting about it, and particularly if we do get peace in the occupied territories in both the West Bank and Gaza, then there is a moment, and I'm sure this country where we are now, the United Arab Emirates, will play a significant role in building regional peace. We need to have that sort of regional look from the Gulf in particular, who can help very much as leadership, but also to work with Israel. I mean, Israel has a right to a secure future, and it's not being helped by this war in Gaza. So that too, I said it before, security is always mutual. It's not unilateral. And it's really important to stabilize the Palestinian state, to get Syria to move through towards a successful transition, and then to actually open up to the peoples of the region about how they want to live together. It's a great prospect.
There's another country that needs devolution, perhaps, but has to figure out how to live with each other after terrible years of war, Yemen.
Yes.
Where you were so involved in mediation. And at certain points, we thought maybe there could be a peace and then it would fall away. Now, and the Gaza war absolutely has had its repercussions for Yemen. How do you see the possibility of peace in Yemen? What would it take?
What was striking for me when I was there in 2018 to 2021 as the UN envoy was how close we came to a political agreement. A ceasefire first, political agreement, not unusual. We came very close. COVID kind of intervened, and we couldn't get access to people because you couldn't travel. And that was particularly important for me in my contacts with Ansarallah, the Houthi movement, which had been daily. But people go back, the movements in the international recognized government, the Houthi movement, others, other militias, return or go back to being a militia, go back to the safety of war, because war is a safe option if you're managing war. And actually peace is a very fragile prospect. And so we retreated from the solution. But the outlines of it was clear. And I didn't manage to succeed. And it got worse with the operation in Marib. Now what's happening, as you say, partly because of the war in Gaza, is the Houthi movement becoming more isolated, more isolationist, detaining in this ghastly way so many people, not just from the UN, but from international NGOs, aid workers basically, accused of espionage without any evidence that I've seen. So that has to be dealt with first, and then go back to, the leadership of the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, and others, to insist on policing a ceasefire, but on the basis of an agreement about a future governance model. I don't think it's impossible, and I think the people deserve it and need it. And it's not about being ruled by one or other, it's about how they are ruled by anyone. I think it's possible. But first, I think we have to get these detainees out.
But this thing about humanitarian workers and journalists, no longer health workers, terrible what's happened to health workers, no longer being safeguarded by anything. And, this goes back to the point of international rules of war, as ugly as war was. Were we naive in thinking that there were laws and rules that people would adhere to, that warring parties would adhere to? Or was there a time when you had to adhere by these rules of law because there were repercussions and there were consequences? How do we get back to a world like that?
Well, I think it's a central proposition for somebody with my background, because, of course, rules of war are not merely being flouted daily, they're being completely ignored. And that's worse in a way. It's just like they don't exist. And that is largely, in my view, because leaders in these countries in conflict have decided to ignore them. They didn't check with us. They didn't check with their people about that. They didn't check with courts and so forth. They didn't check with their obligations. And Gaza, of course, is a terrible, terrible example of this. But as you say, it goes further. And it did used to work. The United Nations is set up for this, of course. ICRC, the International Red Cross, is set up for this. And that has a very distinguished history back to the 19th century, as you know. So I think there is an opportunity to restore it, but it'll be hard work. And it needs to focus as a foundation on accountability, make accountability work, prosecute those people who kill workers, prosecute those people who attack schools and buildings, do inquiries, don't wait until afterwards, but make sure that the teeth are shown. And then talk to people. It's what you do every day. You do every day. Talking to people, I found universally, all the places I traveled for the UN, they haven't changed. They're solid.
I can't end our conversation without speaking of Iraq, my country, because Iraq is one of those places that people prefer not to speak about now. There is a sense that there's no major explosions, no major killing, so it must be things are okay. But the UN is slated to leave Iraq. The UN mission is winding down.
Yes.
And the Iraqi government has been very clear at saying that it feels that the country is now stable, sovereign, doesn't need the offices of the UN, doesn't need the UN mission. And yet, of course, there's a lot still to be healed. And you use the word trauma for the people of Palestine. But of course, I think there's so many traumatized societies, sadly, in our part of the world and all parts of the world where there's war. And so I wanted to take your reflection as the UN winds down, very turbulent 2 and a bit decades in Iraq, but also how a post-conflict country can look like, because so many people now speak about reconstruction in the region. Certainly the IMF and the World Bank want to talk about reconstruction. The Afghan economy is one such example, that if you can start to reconstruct, if you can start to put societies on a different path, it comes through a reconstruction. But there are also many scars of war.
Yes, there are. And it's true of all those countries, isn't it? It's a fundamental truth. And I worked quite a lot some years ago with Kofi Annan when he left the UN, and I was also in Geneva where he was living. And he did a lot of work on transitional justice. He'd done a lot of work on accountability, as you know, when he was Secretary General. And I remember talking to him about Syria, because he was the UN envoy for Syria. I was one of his team, about the timing of transitional justice. And this is always very delicate, isn't it, to make it work. It has to be clear from the outset for ordinary people like you and me that there is going to be accountability. It's not going to be swept under the carpet because the reconstruction needs or simply getting past things, because that doesn't work. It needs to be timed so that it doesn't draw people apart, but actually brings people together. Of course, South Africa is a fascinating example of that. And they're very active in these countries, including in Syria now and elsewhere. But that needs management. It needs advice to the leaders. In Iraq, certainly, you haven't been able to sort that out. And you've got a huge trauma, which somehow, as you say, the world has forgotten. You've got divisions, you've got militias up in the north, and so on.
And in the south.
And in the south, yes, in the south.
Just go by different names now.
It's change a name and you're fine, So it needs to be timed. So I think you're right. The thing about peace is, of course, resilience and investment, but it's also about resolving trauma, getting a prospect of living together within the country and its neighbors and the world, ideally, all of which takes time, but you need to have a plan which you're committed to and you're accountable to. So it's software as much as hardware.
Software is key to all of this, human-to-human relationships. There's one big change in the world, and that is America's position in the world. And we could probably have a podcast completely separately about how do we operate in a world where the US is not playing the role it's played, not only post Second World War, but really post Cold War. And so the world has changed. You spoke about underfunding for the UN, the changes in the region. People would look to the US first for either good or bad. Where are we in a post-American world when it comes to global leadership?
No, I don't think so. I mean, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know, but I may have my opinions. But I don't think so, because the energy with which President Trump goes about being the president of peace, as he puts it, it has its controversial aspects, as I think we all know very well. I certainly do. But it's an energy that wasn't there before. And it's a global one. Look at him. He's now going around Southeast Asia and East Asia. I think, on his 8th war, or 9th perhaps, resolving these places and signing agreements. But that's great, that energy, and you need US leverage. But the US leverage seems to come from tariffs more than values, comes from not so much alliances, but pressure. And I'm not sure that Washington is listening very much to the world, the peoples of the world at least. And it's difficult to do this. It's not a simple matter, but it's important. But I think there is the energy. What we need to infuse that with, if we can, it's not our country, so we are observers and visitors, is to suggest ways in which it can also be grounded in the sort of values which will make peace real. And the President of Peace needs those values to make peace real in these places. That's for sure. Now, this is a bit of a dream at the moment, but let's keep dreaming.
Keeping dreaming and keeping optimistic even when times are difficult. I want to thank you for your really candid answers and taking the time to speak to me today.
Thank you.
And inshallah, we'll hear much more about your efforts in the weeks and months to come. Although I know the way you work, we only hear about it at the very end, if ever. So when this guy was in office, the most important interview, he'd be like, yes, and he'll say really interesting things, but he'll make sure that what will move the needle stays under your hat until it's time to make an announcement, inshallah, for some peace deals.
Wait for it.
I'm sure we'll hear more from you.
I thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Kind.
Thank you for tuning in, and please follow Beyond the Headlines on all your regular podcast providers and go to www.thenationalnews.com for our coverage on these issues and more.